Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to take a very deep look at styles in Groove Agent. They're one of the most powerful and, in my opinion, best features about Groove Agent, but they are shrouded in a lot of mystery. We have this very kind of strange looking interface, which it takes a while to get used to, but once you do, you can actually start making pretty interesting and varied patterns very easily. We also have a set of pattern pads associated with each style, and in many ways this helps to add to the confusion because it seems that these are actually the only rhythms you have access to, and that's simply not true. What we're going to do today is deconstruct a single style. I've chosen the moving forward style from the Songwriter's expansion, but the principles that I'm going to use today could apply to any Groove Agent style. By the end of this video, hopefully, you'll completely understand what this style contains, and more importantly, how best to use it in the music that you're writing. Now, to add an extra bit of spice to this demonstration today, I'm going to use the moving forward style, but I'm going to use a different drum kit. And I'll show you why. I'll click a couple of these pattern pads and we'll have a very quick listen to the rhythm as it currently stands. So I'm clicking on main 1 here, so you're hearing one of the main patterns of this style. This is using hi-hats. If I click on main 11, however, you're going to hear a groove using a ride cymbal. And I decided that ride cymbal was a little bit oppressive. One of my favourite ride cymbals in Groove Agent comes from an expansion called The Kit. So for today's demonstration, we're going to replace this acoustic agent with a different one. The easiest way to do that is from the browser on the right-hand side of Groove Agent. We have this little clock symbol that says load kit with patterns or styles. If you disengage that, you can now load any kit over the top. This will leave the underlying style completely alone and just change the sounds. So now I can click on the Songwriter's icon, scroll down to my kit, expansion, and I'm going to choose nobody else can do it. So when I double click on that patch, it's loading the drum sounds in the background, as you can see, but it's left the style completely alone. So now I'm going to click the main 11 pattern again with the ride on. And now that ride that you're hearing is coming from a different kit. Exactly the same rhythm, but being played by a different kit. This isn't a feature that's particularly well advertised in Groove Agent, and you might think that each kit is locked to its own styles. That is not true. We've cross-pollinated one kit with another now. So exactly what are we getting with this style? What is a style? Well, it's a collection of a bunch of different rhythms, and these 16 pattern pads are merely an illustration of those rhythms. It's not a comprehensive list. So we're effectively going to abandon the pattern pads today. We're not going to use them at all. We're going to work on the raw style itself. The main feature of any style is the main section. Can you see at the top of this dial? It's written in black on dark grey, so it's hard to see, but there's the word main there. These are the primary rhythms. When you click on main 1 in the pattern pad, what you're actually getting is complexity value 1 main rhythm. And if I move the complexity slider down to number 1 and click play in Groove Agent, that's the same rhythm as is currently assigned to main pattern 1. Just before I move away from this, note that currently I have this main 11 pattern highlighted. I've just overwritten that pad. It's no longer going to play main 11. It's actually playing whatever I've updated in this interface. So here's main 1. Watch everything in this style very carefully. Nothing changed. Now I'll click back to main 11 again. It's the same thing because I moved this complexity slider, which was previously set to the number 11. Just to drive the point home, let's click on main 9. Watch the complexity slider. Okay, so there's no mystery about these pattern pads. They're simply reflecting different possible states of this style player. Well, we're going to deconstruct it completely, so we're going to get access to everything that this style can do. And this is how we do it. Firstly, move your complexity slider down to number 1. And for the sake of the demonstration today, I'm going to double click in the intensity text box and type the number 80. Intensity is how loud the rhythm is played. And for my own personal preference, 80 is a really nice sweet spot where all of the drums aren't being hit as hard as Groove Agent can. I really like working at intensity 80. It's a lovely compromise. So all of the rhythms that we play today are going to be at the same intensity. We're just going to change which pattern gets played, and I'll show you how to do that. So here's main complexity 1. What does that rhythm look like? Well, let's drag it into Cubase and have a look. I'm going to use this little button here that says drag MIDI pattern to host sequencer, and I'm going to do exactly that. Let's just close Groove Agent down for a moment. We'll come back to it later. This is main pattern number 1. At the moment, we're in key edit mode. Actually, if you were eagle-eyed, you would have seen that this drum map already existed at the beginning of this video. I've just deleted it to show you what's going on. Create drum map from instrument is the option we want to select. And now, annoyingly, we have to click away and back in again. And now everything updates so we can see all of the drum sounds. So there's main pattern 1 for you. I want the kick at the bottom. I want all of my hi-hat sounds together. So you can rearrange these tracks in the drum map editor to make it easier for you to see what's going on. So now that we've done all that, just mute the rest of my song. We can hear this rhythm played through Cubase. What I'm going to do now is repeat that process for every single variant of rhythm in this style. So if I head over to complexity number 2, you could move this slider, but if you pick this slider up and move it manually, can you see that you're changing the intensity as well? Because that's basically the y-axis. So actually the easiest thing for you to do if you're dragging information into Cubase is double click in the complexity box and just type number 2. Drag, that's that one done. Number 3, and this is going to be tedious if I make you sit here and watch all of these. So I'll drag the rest of them out and we'll see all of the main patterns. Okay, jumped over the boring bit and here's me just finishing the last one. There are 14 different rhythms in this particular style. Most styles actually have 16, but this one doesn't. It caps out at 14. So now we can see all of the 14 main rhythms. Since we're performing this export process though, I'm actually going to do the whole thing. I'm going to drag every single rhythm out of this style, not just the main patterns. So in addition to main patterns, we have fills, intros, and endings. Now this is more consistent across the various styles. You're going to get 8 fills, 4 intros, and 4 endings, and they're represented by these different numbers around the dial. So if I clicked on fill number 1, that's what I'm going to hear. Now there are all sorts of options about how that fill will operate. It's important for me to say that I'm dragging this information into Cubase, and once it's dragged into Cubase, it's fixed. So you don't have the option, for instance, to change whether or not you hear bell rides or no bell rides, or whether you always want to hear crashes or only hear crashes under certain circumstances. So for today's purposes, I'm leaving all of the configuration information in each style completely default. I'm not messing with any of the settings. But having chosen fill number 1, I can now drag that into the host, and there's fill number 1. They're usually only a bar long. Sometimes you'll get 2 bar fills. Now I need to select each of these different options in the main style wheel. So when we were choosing main, we did it for complexity. Complexity only makes any sense, it only has any meaning in the context of the main pattern. From this point onwards, we're using the dial. There's fill number 2. And once again, all I'm going to do now is run all the way around this dial, dragging all of those patterns out. I'll be back in a moment. These 8 patterns are my 8 fills. Then I have 4 endings of different lengths, as you can see. And here are my 4 intros. We're done with the Groove Agent interface now. We don't need it again. Everything that we do from this point onwards can be done in the main Cubase interface. The first thing that I'm going to do is select every MIDI part on this track. There's a shortcut key for this. It's Shift A. But you can simply select them all with the mouse as well. Both of those operations get used an awful lot depending on your context. But I want to see this entire drum rhythm as one. So that's basically every single drum hit in this entire style. And now we can really see, I used the term DNA earlier, I think that's really the DNA of the drum rhythm. And I'm seeing lots of really interesting stuff. For instance, all of these rhythms all contain hats. But whatever's going on up here is using ride cymbals. And then we have a combination of some of these grooves using hats and some of them using ride. That's really important for me to know. If I'm putting a rhythm together, I don't want to be interchangeably switching between hats and rides without understanding what I'm doing. So now that I can see the entire style laid out in front of me like this, I can start separating this out into functional areas. I can start making sense of how this pattern's going to work. I can see the ones that have really active tom work. I can see the rhythms that get carried away with their crashes. If you want something really dramatic at the end of your song, that's really easy for me to see. I now don't have to write copious notes about all of these various different sounds, and I don't have to just rely on completely random luck, dragging various different styles out onto Cubase to try to kind of construct a pattern. I can use my eyes to visually help me. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to build a drum rhythm for some music that I have sat in the background that we've not even heard yet. We don't care about it at the moment. But once we've got this style DNA a little bit more under our control, we'll be ready to start. So the first thing that I'm going to do is rearrange all of these drum sounds now so that they're in exactly the order that I want. I want the kick down at the bottom, and I want the snare on top of it. I want my crash cymbals right at the top of my drum map. This is simply how I work. You choose your own layout for how this stuff's going to work. I want my rides together. I want my toms collected together, and they're going to be down at the bottom, just above my snare. So in a matter of seconds, I've got this thing looking far more visually useful. There's a tom run, for instance. I can see exactly what's going on. I've got a hi-hat pedal, a couple of hi-hat tips, and a couple of shank. Let's move those so that they're in some sort of order as well. Okay, that's a really good visual representation of what's going on now. So here's the way we're going to work. I'm going to create a MIDI track, and my MIDI output is going to be the main engine of the Groove Agent. So Groove Agent has basically two different MIDI ports. Main talks to the drum sounds themselves, the instruments. The pattern pad, basically if you press the key on the keyboard or a virtual key, it would send an instruction to play an entire pattern. Well, we don't want that. We want to access to the individual instrument sounds. So that's Groove Agent main. Channel 1 is fine. There's my MIDI track. And the very first thing that I'm going to do is pick up all of these MIDI parts, drag them down onto this MIDI track, rename this Do Not Edit. That's now my master groove. I'm not going to touch any of those MIDI parts again. I'm going to leave it completely alone. So if I ever need to get back to the original rhythms, they're all there. Now I'm going to duplicate this MIDI track, and this is my sandpit. This is where I'm going to play. So I'm going to mute all of those original parts. And if I'd created my drum map properly, which is just simply a case of selecting the drum map that we've already extracted out of the instrument, I can always see the entire rhythm at a moment's notice. Now, one of the advertised features of these styles is that you can basically swap and change them at will. You can put any style next to each other, change from main 1 to main 4 to fill 1 to fill 3, and everything is going to sound great. There is actually an issue with that, and it's to do with the fact that the drum rhythms aren't quantized. I'm going to show you one single example. I'm just going to scroll in to bar 68. You see these two crash hits? They're right next to each other. That's because one of the crashes occurs at the end of this particular rhythm, and there's also a crash at the beginning of this rhythm. If you create a rhythm that uses those two MIDI parts side by side, you're going to get all sorts of phasing issues. It's not going to sound good. But I want to go even deeper than that. I don't just want to use these patterns in their entirety. I actually want to break them up into smaller functional chunks, because what you've actually got here is a much, much larger palette than the 30 individual MIDI parts that we have here. We've got 14 plus 8 plus 4 plus 4. Each of these MIDI parts can actually be cut up into multiple smaller chunks, and they're also really useful, usable pieces of rhythm. What I need is a heuristic. Doesn't everybody need a heuristic in their life? Basically, a general rule that I'm going to use to ensure that these areas of conflict, where different rhythms are talking a different language, one has the quantized note just at the end of the bar, the other one has it at the beginning. I'm going to impose an arbitrary rule. I'm going to say that any section of rhythm, every MIDI part, that has a crash at the very beginning of that part, I'm going to delete it. So for example, here's a crash right at the very beginning of the very first main part. Gone. Don't want it. In the case of this particular rhythm, what you'll find is that most of the main patterns have a crash sound at the beginning, and I'm just throwing them all away. Let's select the entire thing again and see what we're doing in context. When we finally get to bar 68, which is the problem that I'd highlighted earlier, this means that the crash sound belonging to this particular MIDI part won't be there. And now if during the course of writing my song, I select those two MIDI parts to be placed together, I'm only going to get a single crash sound. Now it turns out that the quantized groove of a rhythm is very important. You don't want to just quantize this entire thing to 16ths or 30 seconds. You're going to lose a lot of the natural feeling of the pattern and a lot of the stuff that makes it sound good. If you zoom in far enough, you can see that very few of these notes are actually exactly on the bar. In fact, a large number of the notes that are exactly on the beat, I should say, occur at the beginning of each MIDI part. This isn't a completely universal rule, but you will generally find that if you select MIDI notes right at the very beginning of a part, let's find one that's a good example. There's one. I'm willing to bet that when this style was created, that hit was very slightly before the beat, and it's actually been quantized so that it's at 0. In other words, a large amount of legwork has been done on this style to make it functional, to make it usable. You'll find a disproportionate number of notes that occur at the beginning of the style actually have a quantized value of 0. And I'm very sure you often see 1s and 2s and 3s. But of course, if that was anything less than 0, it wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be inside the style. And so they've just been brought forwards. I'm fine with that. I understand that to have these kind of modular patterns, there has to be some sort of compromise. What I'd really like to do, however, is to split these patterns up even further, because these patterns very often might contain stuff that I'm interested in, but also stuff that I'm not particularly interested in. I've listened to the first 3 bars of this rhythm, which is absolutely fine. A really nice, stock, gentle, rolling rhythm. But I'm not a big fan of that last bar. So I'm going to chop this rhythm up into a 3 and a 1, and that 3 will be much more usable to me. I'll actually use it far more often in the song. I might have abandoned main 1 entirely if it had been left as a 4-bar rhythm, because I'm not particularly a big fan of this last bar. So of course it's very easy for me to get my scissors out and to cut those 2 things up. And now I've got 2 different patterns of different lengths. That's completely fine. I'm just going to undo that process. This hi-hat hit at the beginning of bar 8 is occurring 6 ticks into the bar. What would happen if it was there at 118, 2 ticks before the end of the bar? Let's do that same cut-up process. That's a bit strange, isn't it? We've just chopped up a MIDI part, having left this hi-hat hit at 118. If you select it, you'll see that it started at 0. Furthermore, if you select the other MIDI part, you've got a hi-hat hit at 118. If I now select both of those MIDI parts and zoom in, I have 2 hi-hat hits 2 ticks apart. Very fine quantized drum rhythms create an absolute nightmare if you want to cut up rhythms and use them in a modular fashion, because you very often end up with these situations where you've got notes right at the very end of one pattern and right at the very beginning of another. So what can I do to mitigate that problem? I basically don't want to have to encounter any of that headache. So here's the trick. This is what we're going to do to get around the problem. I'm going to Shift A to select all of the MIDI parts. I'm going to open my logical editor and I'm going to select a preset called Select Notes Near End of Bar. And now my patrons and channel members have access to all of my logical editor presets, but as you can see, it's a relatively straightforward process. What I'm basically doing is I'm only looking for notes that occur right at the very end of a bar range, and this 1920 is effectively representing 4 bars worth of ticks. I'm not going to get into the maths of logical editor today, that would take too long. But if I click apply and we zoom in nice and tight, all of these black notes are notes that occur right at the end of a bar. At the moment, I don't particularly care whether or not they're also at the end of a MIDI part. I'm only interested in notes that occur right at the end of a bar. So if we scroll in, here's that shank hi-hat that I moved earlier. This note is at 118, and so it satisfies the criterion of being right at the end of a bar. This is an instruction to me to be careful about cutting at that point, because if I do, I'm going to create myself a problem. The decision's now up to me what I do with that information. The easiest thing for me to do is simply select the note and quantize it to 0. You see now it's now at start 0. If I once again select all of the parts and repeat my logical edit process, now that note isn't being selected because it's no longer at the end of a bar. So if I wanted to make multiple parts out of this rhythm, I would not chop at bar number 7. That's going to leave me with a kick right at the very end of the bar. That's going to create issues with double kicks. I'm not interested in any of that. So what I can now do with this single logical edit preset is run through this huge list of rhythm information, all of these different rhythm sections. I can now chop them up into chunks where there are no notes right at the end of the bar. So I can, for instance, make a cut at bar number 6, and I know that this rhythm is going to be completely internally consistent. Whenever you do a cut like this, it deselects your notes, which is not a problem. Just run your logical edit preset again. And it's surprisingly quick to do this stuff. You can run through an entire style pattern in maybe 5 minutes, effectively just running along the rhythm, looking for every bar where there are no notes and cutting it up. I'm going to take a note of the time, do it off camera, come back and tell you how long it took. I'll be back shortly. Okay, that took me 4 minutes. So we've got 2 separate rules. Crashes aren't allowed to live right at the beginning of a MIDI part. Second rule, nothing other than crashes is allowed to live right at the end of a MIDI part. What this means is that this entire rhythm is now completely modular. What I'm going to do now is give you a very quick demonstration of how I would go about actually building a rhythm pattern out of this information. Step number 1, I'm going to separate hats and ride into 2 separate MIDI tracks, because that's a very important distinction that's made in these rhythms. So the ride's going to start at bar 41. I've got these 2 editors locked together with this little link project button. Makes it really easy to perform this kind of synchronized editing. And I'm simply selecting all of my MIDI parts and looking for anything that has ride. So they're starting at 69. Pick all of those up, drop those down to the hats part. Here's a couple of ride-based patterns. So I think I've got all of that right. I've assigned my drum map to these tracks. And if I have a look, there's no rides left on the hats track. And all of these have rides everywhere. That's really the only primary distinction I want to make between these 2 tracks. Now I'm going to drag them all back to the beginning of the project. Grid shuffle is a really nice function for this kind of stuff. You can pick up MIDI parts and then drag them to the left, and it actually clusters all of the MIDI parts together. Really convenient way to join stuff together, basically remove gaps and then send it back into grid mode. So that is now a huge, really flexible, very easy to see set of patterns that I can finally, if I was doing this in real time, it would take me maybe 10 to 15 minutes to get to this stage, an incredibly short amount of time for the power that I have now when I come to start writing this piece of music. Not even talked about actually writing any music yet. This is all just prep. But very quickly I'm at this stage where I've got an enormous amount of power at my hands and I don't have to try to remember how all of those styles work together. I can pick up these patterns, and what I like to do is actually kind of leave these 2 tracks largely alone. I'll duplicate, so I've selected 3 bars here. Remember, I didn't particularly like that 4th bar. I'll just duplicate the parts that I'm interested in. And then let's grab a fill. All of my fills are up here at the end. I know that all of these are hats-based fills, so let's just grab one, duplicate it, drag that in, and we'll audition this first 8 bars of the song, finally bring in some music, and start having fun. Everything just works. Now, that might not be the rhythm I finally decide on. I might choose to try a different fill to audition, but you can see how quick and easy it is to get into this kind of songwriting groove of just throwing these patterns, because I can use my eyes now. I can see what's going on. At bar 21, I move into a bridge, which is much more airy, strummed guitars, and the bass stretches out into single languid notes. This is the perfect opportunity for me to use my ride patterns. So I'll show you an example of me having a bit of a play with the ride. For this particular 8-bar bridge, I'm going to end off with a more dramatic tom flourish, but I don't want a big tom run in the middle of this pattern. So let's just have a look at my ride options. So I'll choose something nice and simple. First 3 bars of this chunk over here, probably going to be fine. Let's have another look at these rhythms. So I don't want any dramatic toms. There's my tom, my big tom fills. So let's try that one, which is a fairly simple fill. Then I'm going to take the same 3 bars again to give myself some consistency. And this time I do want a dramatic tom fill. So let's go for the one here. We'll see what that sounds like, and I'll cycle it around so that we come out of the bridge back into the main pattern that we built earlier. Nice. It's a snare fill. Should have dragged them there, but not to worry, that worked perfectly well. I might try the other tom fill, the other kind of reasonably dramatic one, but that one was completely fine for demo purposes. Just shows you the advantage of being able to visually see this stuff. You don't need to audition using your ears and spend the entire 4 bars listening to the style to find out what's in it. You can see what's in it. I know I want ride. I know I want a tom fill at various different parts of the song for different reasons, and I can jump straight there really easily. Hope this video has been useful to you. Please hit like if it was. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.